Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to our monthly program of the Traverse Area Historical Society. My name is Siciliano, and I'll be your speaker today, and I also happen to be the president of the board of directors for the society. And so I see a number of folks in the audience that are not members. I just want to give you a brief overview of what the society is and does. We are a nonprofit 501c3. And our mission is to present, preserve, and protect the local history of our area. Abraham Lincoln didn't necessarily have a connection with Traverse City, but there have been people that had saw my 2017 presentation and wanted to see it again, and so you're kind of seeing a rerun, but I hope you will enjoy it. The Society's activities include these monthly programs, historical tours, which we provide during the summer and the autumn. We support the archives here at Tattle, as well as scholarships for our area students. Michigan History Day is coming up. The Society funds any local student that for their registration fee for the Michigan History Day, both locally and if they happen to get selected to go on to the state competition, we fund that. And as we did last year, one of our local students actually was competitive enough to go to the national competition, and we helped to fund that student as well. We are an entirely volunteer organization. We don't have any paid positions. And all of our revenues come from memberships and donations to enable us to do the tours, the programs, and the scholarships that we offer. Today's presentation is in part based on a wonderful collection of Lincoln caricatures authored by Rufus Rockwell Wilson. And you're welcome to come up afterwards and take a look. There's more than 150. I'm only going to select 14 for today to illustrate the presentation. So what I'm going to talk about today is Abraham Lincoln through the eyes of political cartoonists. This first caricature is Abraham Lincoln around the time of 1864 when he's in the midst of running for re-election as president. He's holding George McClellan, who I will say a few more words about as we get into the talk today. McClellan, of course, was a famous Union Civil War general. He also happened to be the 1864 Democratic presidential opponent to Abraham Lincoln. And this is clearly a pro-Lincoln cartoon. Most of the cartoons actually during that time were not favorable to the president, but this one was. And if you can't read in the very back what the president is saying, this reminds me of a little joke. And it turned out McClellan was not at all successful in the 1864 campaign, and of course Abraham Lincoln was reelected. So to begin with, most historians consider Abraham Lincoln our greatest president. Despite changing attitudes among historians and the general public about presidential leadership, Lincoln remains undoubtedly the most popular and most respected former occupant of the White House. Yet this view has not, and is still not, universally held. Historian Stephen Oates suggests that Lincoln, just before his assassination, was probably the most hated president in history. Today, I'd like to examine for you both President Lincoln's successes and failures during the Civil War in order to answer the question, was Abraham Lincoln a great president? I'll be using these caricatures to illustrate those points as I go along. I welcome your questions and comments at the conclusion. To assist in this evaluation, I would suggest to you that we look at Lincoln's leadership in two ways. In terms of political leadership, President Lincoln was a master politician. He set out to save the Union and used power effectively to accomplish this political goal. Yet, ultimately, he created a new Union, one in which was free of slavery and extended the promise of liberty and democracy to more of its citizens. He achieved these goals even in the face of unprecedented challenges. While his record was open to criticism in some areas, and you'll see some of this in the caricatures, overall he was without peer in mastering the political scene. As a military leader, his performance was more mixed. Lincoln's efforts did lead to some serious mistakes. His overall involvement in the Eastern Theater and his appointment of poor professional and disastrous political generals will illustrate this. Yet, he will develop important innovations, such as the enlistment of black soldiers, lead brilliant strategies in the Navy and State Departments, and oversee the Western Theater, where the Confederacy eventually died. When Lincoln became our 16th president on March the 4th, 1861, he had a clear vision of what he wanted to accomplish in terms of the secession crisis, the breaking away of the southern states. Yet he faced reduced options. The 7 states of the lower South had formally seceded from the Union and formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America. Given the strength of the secessionist forces in these states, little could have been done to stop this development. Lincoln still, however, had 8 slave states that stayed in the Union. Lincoln's principles clearly defined his position on secession. He had long argued that the federal union of states was perpetual. No legal means existed for a state to separate or secede from the Union. A state that seceded committed a revolutionary act that was bound to lead to anarchy. Lincoln, like most Northerners, believed that majority rule required that the minority, in this case the South, honor the popular will of the majority. At the same time, Lincoln believed that the Constitution guaranteed the minority their civil rights. If the Union was dissolved, not only would democracy in the United States be undermined, but also that democracy throughout the world would receive a fatal blow. Recall that at this time, the United States was kind of unique as a democratic republic. And so when we looked at ourselves as a nation, it was not simply that we ourselves enjoyed democracy. We saw ourselves as a model for the world to adopt that method of governance. For without the American model, few Northerners believed that democracy would have much of a chance of being sustained elsewhere. In his inaugural address, the new president stressed his belief in the perpetual union and his duty to hold and protect federal properties throughout the United States, including the self-proclaimed Confederacy. At the same time, correctly assessing the seriousness of the situation, he did not want to worsen the crisis. In particular, he did not want to provoke the remaining slave states in the Union to join their Confederate sisters. Thus, he promised not to interfere with slavery where it existed, nor insist for the time being to attempt to engage in federal activities in the Lower South. He concluded a reference to the secessionists during his inaugural address. "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of Civil War." Lincoln's inaugural speech was intentionally ambiguous. So this is a Thomas Nast illustration just a few days after the inaugural address, and it shows the ambiguity of the speech itself. That you could look at the speech, as I'll say in a moment, and you could interpret it either way.
So on the one hand, Lincoln's approach is that of trying to be a peaceful arbiter between the differences of North and South. And thus, peace is the message. You see there on the balance between the Northerner in the top hat and the Southerner with the revolver in his hand, trying to show that the president is trying to say, peace is what I want. And indeed, of course, he did want peace. At the same point, you could also interpret the inaugural address as a somewhat warlike statement. And that is very clear in this side of the caricature. Lincoln, the warrior with a bloodied sword, stabbing the slave-holding Southerner with his whip of the slave and his revolver, and making the point, I'm not going to accept this. You are going to be defeated. So, is he for peace or for war? Well, what Lincoln was trying to do with his inaugural address was to buy himself time, to give himself the little flexibility he had to figure out what he's going to do when 7 states of our country have left. Consequently, historians and contemporaries have debated the meaning of the address. Most often, people have stressed what they wanted to see in the speech. Southerners from the Deep South denounced it as a declaration of war. Most Republicans praised its firmness. Many Northern Democrats criticized it as either being too obscure or too vague. But the question was, what would the slave states still in the Union think about the speech? And for them, the vast majority of those members of the Upper South felt that the president had given the right balance to the crisis. And so Lincoln's inaugural address is, in a sense, successful for what he wanted to do, was to not make the situation any worse. And so his main purpose, can I buy some time? He believed that given time, the Southern people would come to their senses and come back into the Union. But time was not on Lincoln's side. One of the last remaining federal-held forts in the Lower South was Fort Sumter in Charleston Bay, South Carolina. And it increasingly got a symbolic value far greater than its military value, for it was one of the few remaining federal forts that were in the South, in federal hands, but looking right there to the Confederates who were surrounding it. Fort Sumter had become, thus, a symbol of our nationhood. Were we still one nation, or were we coming apart? And to give up Fort Sumter to the new Confederacy would be a great blow to our Northern patriotic pride and would render impotent Lincoln's promise to hold federal properties in the South. Unfortunately, on his second day in office, Lincoln receives word from Major Robert Anderson, who was the commander of Fort Sumter, that the garrison would have to be evacuated if it was not resupplied in the coming weeks. Eager not to lose the support of the remaining slave states or start a war over an undefendable position, the general of the armies, Winfield Scott, and all but one of Lincoln's cabinet members urged the president to give up the fort. The president could have bent to this pressure and evacuated Sumter, but instead he held firm to his principles to protect federal property and this remaining symbol of the Union in the Lower South. Delaying a decision to evacuate also provided time for the Northern public to have their feelings heard. By the end of March, the public was voicing overwhelming support for the defense of the fort. As one man wrote Lincoln, "Give up Sumter, sir, and you are as dead politically as John Brown is physically." And so Lincoln polled his cabinet again and found he only had 2 members of the cabinet that wanted to give up Sumter. With now the public and the political leaders backing his view, Lincoln acted. On April the 6th, he ordered the remaining forts in the lower South, such as Sumter, to be resupplied. But not wanting to provoke warfare, he informed the governor of South Carolina that Sumter would only be sent supplies and that reinforcements would not be sent unless Sumter was attacked. The plan was a masterstroke. If the Confederates fired on a supply vessel, they could be accused of attacking a mission of humanity, bringing food to hungry soldiers. Far worse, if the Confederates could be blamed for starting this war. On the other hand, the Southerners did not attack the supply vessel. The Federal garrison would be resupplied, thus preserving peace for the time being and providing more time for the administration to strengthen its support in the Union slave states and even weaken the secessionists in the lower South. If Fort Sumter, sitting right there in one of the major harbors of the Confederacy, is in federal hands, how can the Confederacy say they're really an independent nation? Well, now faced with this dilemma, the Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, and his administration decided to demand Anderson surrender before the supply ship arrived. If Anderson refused, the shore batteries would attack. Davis's cabinet offered only one prophetic dissent. Secretary of State Robert Toombs said the following: "You will wantonly strike a hornet's nest. Legions now quiet will swarm out and sting us to death. It is unnecessary. It puts us in the wrong. It is fatal." Well, Toombs's thoughts were rejected, and when Major Anderson refused to surrender, the Confederates opened fire on April the 12th. The supply ship was unable to land, and after 33 hours of bombardment, the fort was forced to surrender. The Confederates had won their first battle, but in attacking, fulfilled both Toombs's predictions and Lincoln's plan. The bombardment united the North in its determination to restore the Union at any cost. Now, Lincoln's actions were not universally successful. The Upper South now joined the Confederacy in April and May. But the border slave states of Missouri, Delaware, and Kentucky remained in the Union. Lincoln's hands-off policy in Kentucky, for instance, was key to keeping his native state safe within the Union. But Lincoln's handling of Maryland was more controversial. If Maryland had seceded from the Union, of course, Washington, D.C. would be lost, because if Maryland, of course, Maryland is north of Washington, D.C., and so our nation's capital would be totally surrounded by the Confederacy. Now, secessionist public pressure forced Unionist Governor Thomas Hicks to call the legislature into session. Lincoln realized that drastic measures were needed. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which required a citizen to be told why they are being held, in part of Maryland. The federal government arrested many Marylanders for alleged anti-unionist activities. The Lincoln administration even imprisoned the mayor of Baltimore and 19 members of the state legislature. Federal troops occupied Baltimore and many other important points. Intimidated by the show of force and the rising unionist sentiment in Western Maryland, the legislature rejected secession. But Lincoln's attack on civil liberties of Maryland did not go uncontested. His suspension of the writ of habeas corpus infuriated our Chief Justice of the United States, Roger Taney, who you might recall had led the court to the infamous case that suggested that African Americans were not citizens, nor could they even be humans for that matter, in the Dred Scott decision. Well, Chief Justice Taney accused the president of usurping power. Taney argued that only Congress could legally suspend the writ, and he admonished Lincoln not to violate the very laws he had been sworn to defend. The Chief Justice ordered in ex parte Merryman that one of the jailed Marylanders, a John Merryman, be released, since the government had violated his rights. Lincoln ignored the court order. Lincoln openly defended such an invasion of civil liberties, contending that strict measures were essential if the laws of the Union and liberty itself were to survive the war. Lincoln said this: "Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated?" The Republicans who controlled Congress by this time sustained the president's view by passing the Habeas Corpus Act in 1863. So this caricature from London Fun, this is in November of 1863, so it's a bit later, so it will include a few other of Lincoln's policies, but I think it's a good illustration both of two things. One, that the British press was generally anti-Lincoln and anti-Union. Much of the press was pro-Confederate. So you will see the British cartoons often are quite critical of Lincoln. And here we have a caricature of Abraham Lincoln, referred to as the Yankee Guy Fawkes. Of course, that's a reference to the British revolutionary who attempted to blow up the Parliament. And so here we've got Lincoln, and we've got this basically a straw man. Of course, it's George Washington, a reference to the Constitution, to liberties. And what we've got Lincoln doing is burning up the Constitution, or what they call the Charter of American Laws. So among the things being destroyed is states' rights and liberty and submissions to the laws. And what is he burning? What is the fuel of trying to destroy this Constitution? Well, it's the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, and as I'll talk about a little later, it's the Emancipation Proclamation, it's the draft laws, all of which are burning up the Constitution by this person who wants to wreck the Constitution and destroy the whole thing. And so as you see there in the back there, the reference is, are you going to help this person help burn up the Constitution? And that is the perspective of many of those opponents, both abroad, but also in the North, that question Lincoln's violation of civil liberties. But as Lincoln says, if you don't take a firm hand to deal with this situation, we might lose the whole thing. Lincoln's pragmatic approach to putting down secessionism in Maryland anticipated his handling of dissent in the North throughout the war. Starting in 1862, the president centralized jurisdiction over internal security matters in the War Department. We often think about Homeland Security and the things that we have to do today in dealing with security. Well, Abraham Lincoln was dealing with a much greater threat to our country than what we see today, and he was beginning to increase civilian oversight within the War Department to address that. To deal with such matters, the department created a corps of civilian provost marshals. At the same time, the president assumed the right to establish martial law over portions of the northern states, even somewhat far away from the war itself. Now, martial law went much further than simply suspending habeas corpus, for it not only allowed the imprisonment but punishment by military commissions of those considered disloyal. The use of martial law was also well outside constitutional practice and would ultimately be declared unconstitutional by a Republican Supreme Court after the Civil War. What happened during the Civil War, though, was that this power was used for the temporary suspension of some 300 newspapers for expressing, as it said, wrong sentiments, the arbitrary arrests of some 20,000 people, and even the disruption of proceedings of civil courts. These, of course, were all seen as necessary to clamp down on disloyalty in the northern states. But it, of course, had an important partisan effect because it also helped to clamp down on the northern Democrats. When Democratic governors, for instance, refused to allow soldiers to go home, or rather, when Democratic governors refused to allow Union soldiers to fill out absentee ballots, the president, as commander-in-chief, simply ordered the soldiers to go home to vote. And how did the soldiers fighting day after day in the Civil War respond? 80% of Union soldiers during the Civil War voted Republican. Now, the Republicans were not also above using strong armed tactics during the elections, even arresting some pro-democratic candidates and voters. But through these efforts, some extra-constitutional, if not unconstitutional, as well as just simply the support that the northern public had for Lincoln and the Republicans, the White House as well as Congress stayed in Republican hands during the Civil War. Now, the Republicans argued, looking at this, portraying Abraham Lincoln as this revolutionary, the Republicans argued that the Democrats couldn't be trusted with the Union. But such arguments were not true. Most Northern Democrats clearly wanted to save the Union. They wanted to put the country back together. But as the war dragged on, the Democrats insisted on keeping the Union as it was back in 1860. Lincoln and the Republicans, on the other hand, began to call for a new Union, one that strengthened the national government and would abolish slavery. Lincoln's pragmatism mixed with principle when he used his political skills to move the country to support the end of slavery. Lincoln had spoken many times on his view of slavery. He once branded slavery as, quote, an unqualified evil to the Negro, the white man, and to the state. The monstrous injustice of slavery deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites. It's interesting that there's a modern analogy to this from Lincoln. During the 1950s and 60s, when we were competing on the world stage against the Soviet Union and world communism, many of the people back home were arguing that the mistreatment of the civil rights workers in the South during the 1950s and 60s undermined our credibility when trying to win over the third world against the Soviet Union and the communists. And so here we have 100 years before Lincoln saying, look, if we can't show our true nature to support liberty here at home, how can we contend to be a model abroad? Yet Lincoln pursued his principles pragmatically. He knew that he had to maintain the loyalty of those slave states still in the Union. As any suggestion of the federal government imposing abolition, he suggested it would destroy Union sentiment in the border states. As he said, "I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game. Kentucky gone, we cannot hold Missouri, nor, as I think, Maryland. We would as well consent to a separation at once." By the spring of 1862, Lincoln and the Republicans became convinced that the war must end slavery. But Lincoln's approach would be gradual. In April, we started this process by Congress passing compensated emancipation of the slaves in the District of Columbia. This was a safe thing to do. Washington, D.C. is a federal territory, a federal district, so Congress had absolute control over it. And so what the federal Congress did was to say, okay, we're going to now basically buy your slaves. And they did. For $300 a head, the United States Congress bought the slaves and thus ended slavery in our nation's capital. In June, Congress prohibited slavery in all federal territories. And in July, passed a second confiscation act that specified that any slave coming in Union lines would be free. At the same time, Lincoln worked hard to get the border states to agree to let Congress end slavery in their states by offering the slaveholders financial compensation. Hey, it worked in Washington, D.C. Why not sell your slaves to the federal government so we can free them and end slavery in your states? But on 3 separate occasions, representatives of those border states said, no, we will not sell our slaves. And so on the evening of that third rejection, the president went before the cabinet to establish an Emancipation Proclamation. On July the 22nd, he convened the cabinet to inform his officers that he intended to do so. It's interesting that Lincoln's principle was such, he didn't ask the cabinet to say, well, what do you think? He basically put it out there and said, this is what we're going to do. But Secretary of State Seward, who was in many ways even more pragmatic politically than his president, said, maybe this is not necessarily a good time to do it right now, because July was coming off one of the most disastrous federal defeats at the 7 Days battles, and it would look as if the Lincoln administration was out of desperation going with emancipation on the heels of a defeat. So what Seward suggested to Lincoln, and Lincoln agreed, was let's wait for a Union victory and then issue the Emancipation Proclamation. After the Union turned back General Lee's first invasion of the North at the Battle of Antietam, then Lincoln acted. So what we have here is another British cartoon. This one from the London Punch, October 1862. So the Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary one, was issued on the 22nd of September. The British are reacting to it, and despite Seward's practical experience and suggestion and the fact that Lincoln did issue it on the heels of a Union victory at Antietam, the British basically say, we see through it. And so what we see here is Lincoln and Jefferson Davis playing cards. And the caption, if you can't read it in the back, is Abe Lincoln's last card. And so they're basically competing. The war is now turned into a card game, and Lincoln throws down his last card. You may not be able to see that, but the ace of spades, which Lincoln is holding, actually it's a face of an African American person. And so what he's basically doing is throwing down and saying, okay, this is my last gasp. I'm going to try to play the race card and see if I can get undermine the South through the Emancipation Proclamation. What the Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary one, said was that we're going to give the Confederates until the first of the year, 1863. If they stop this rebellion, then they'll come back in the Union and they can keep their slaves. However, if they don't, if they're still in rebellion in January 1st, 1863, the slaves in those areas that are still controlled by the Confederacy shall be thenceforward and forever free. In essence, Lincoln was freeing the slaves where the Confederates controlled them. The proclamation was justified solely on military necessity. It endorsed voluntary colonization of freed slaves, and it reiterated Lincoln's plea for the gradual emancipation of the slave states in the Union, the border states, by offering once again to pay for their slaves. This conservative approach was deliberate. Still uncertain about how the country would respond to such a revolutionary step, the president announced it in a manner designed to cushion the shock and make emancipation appear a necessary means of winning the war. And so if you recall, this is how many Northerners saw it. He's destroying the Constitution. And so Lincoln's approach is very conservative, stressing that the only reason we're freeing the slaves is it's going to help to destroy the Confederacy and bring an end to the war. And so as a result, on January 1st, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, proclaiming freedom to all slaves in the slave states that were part of the Confederacy. And thus, this historic document announced a new war aim. Thenceforward, the Union Army became officially an army of liberation. The North was now fighting to create a new Union, not restore the old one. But Lincoln worried. He looked at the proclamation and he knew that it was only an executive order. Would it stand up to a future president, to a future Congress, to a future Supreme Court? And so he decided to turn it into a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. The Senate passed the Abolition of Slavery Amendment in April of 1864, but the opposition of Northern Democrats was so much that the House would not pass it before the 1864 presidential election. Has any of you seen Steven Spielberg's Lincoln? If you haven't, it does an excellent job of showing exactly how Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans helped to get that measure passed. For Lincoln used during his reelection effort the popular mandate to press the House to pass the amendment. During the winter of 64 and 65, he used all his powers of persuasion and patronage to get it through. He buttonholed conservative Republicans and opposition Democrats and exhorted them to support it. He told them that they had a lot better chance for federal jobs they desired if they voted for the measure. With the outcome much in doubt, the president and congressional Republicans participated in secret negotiations never made public that involved patronage, a New Jersey railroad company monopoly, and the release of certain Confederates that were related to some of our congressional Democrats. Republican congressional leader Thaddeus Stevens claimed, quote, "The greatest measure of the 19th century was passed by corruption, aided and abetted by the purest man in America." And so on January 31st, 1865, the House adopted the amendment with only 3 votes to spare. getting to the required 2/3 necessary to send it out to the states. Lincoln pronounced the amendment a great moral victory, and when it was ratified in that following December by the states, the amendment would end bondage everywhere in America. Now, not everyone saw either the Emancipation Proclamation nor what became the 13th Amendment in very positive light. Aldebert Volk was a pro-Confederate Marylander who was responsible for these caricatures from Baltimore. Not all newspapers were silenced during the Civil War, and certainly his cartoons got press. What we have here is a very oppositional Democratic view of Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. Writing the Emancipation Proclamation is the title. We've got Abraham Lincoln writing the Emancipation Proclamation. His foot is on the Constitution, the book on the floor. You see here a devil helping him with his inkwell so he can write all of the Emancipation Proclamation. Up in the picture there is St. Potawatomi, a reference to John Brown. And of course, John Brown was guilty of the Potawatomi Massacre back in Bleeding Kansas time, but it's more of a reference to John Brown's raid and his efforts to stir up and create a slave rebellion in Virginia. The other picture on the wall is St. Domingo. That was a reference to the slave rebellion in the 1790s that ultimately led to the end of French colonial rule, but it was portrayed in the most awful light, the very idea that former Africans could rule themselves. So you have a sense then of the view of Abraham Lincoln, even to the point where justice is got their head covered because no justice is being done. A far more positive view of this being of the proposed 13th Amendment comes by Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. A northern newspaper, it's not surprising, it's a very positive caricature. And Lincoln is showing the letter of the law, now the change of slavery being broken away with the constitutional amendment, having passed the Congress by its necessary 2/3 and going out to the states for ratification. And Lincoln is quoted to say, "This is like a dream I once had in Illinois." Of course, his opposition to slavery dated back to his time when he lived in Illinois before being president. And here we have a very positive view of the end of bondage and the end of slavery, among the most important consequences of the Civil War. As a political leader then, Lincoln was prepared to do whatever was necessary to save the nation and form a new, more perfect union. This ends justifies the means philosophy was also blazingly clear in Lincoln's approach to military affairs. Unfortunately, his success here was more qualified. The president, as commander-in-chief, started the war with less expertise or wisdom than he had as a political leader. His problems began when faced with appointing generals for the army. With the selection of military-trained officers, it had somewhat of a mixed set of results. But the appointment of politicians as general officers was nearly fatal for our nation. Between November of 1862 and April of 1864, the ranking field generals of the Union Army were two Massachusetts politicians, Benjamin F. Butler and Nathaniel Banks. Both men were devoid of military training, whose martial accomplishments ranged from disasters to fiascos. In 1864, General-in-Chief Henry Halleck wrote to General William Tecumseh Sherman, quote, "It seems a little better than murder to give important commands to men such as Banks and Butler and others, but it seems impossible to prevent it." And so I'd like to just start with this caricature. This is another Volk caricature in July of 1861. So just to give you a context here, July of 1861, a couple of months after Fort Sumter, the Union has faced its first major land defeat at the Battle of First Bull Run. So what is the criticism? Well, as Volk points out, Lincoln is leading the comedy of death. And each of these gentlemen are some of the puppets of Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, who was seen as a major political force within Lincoln's cabinet. So just to give you an overview here, we've got Simon Cameron, who was Lincoln's first Secretary of War. And Cameron was so incompetent and so corrupt that even Lincoln couldn't stand it anymore, so he gave him a new job, far away from Washington. He became our new ambassador to Russia. Benjamin Butler, who I will say a few words later, that one of the Massachusetts politicians who was fairly incompetent in the field. Gideon Welles, who actually was quite effective, but of course, consider the source here. Another political general, John C. Fremont, was completely humiliated by Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley campaign. Winfield Scott was soon to retire. And then we have General George McClellan on his horse. And we'll say a few words about him a little later. So clearly, the attack against Lincoln had some justice to it, because he did have some poor choices when it came to generals of the army, many of them who were politicians. And this, I think, was unfortunate, because Lincoln had what I view as a misguided view that he had to win over these politicians by giving them general positions. But this, of course, meant that the field commands were put in hands of people who were not competent, and that, of course, was costly for our own soldiers. This is another etching, again from Adelbert Volk. This one coming in 1863. Abraham Lincoln is Don Quixote, and Benjamin Butler as his Sancho Panza. Again, not a very kind view of either the president or of General Butler. But again, Butler was not much of a respected figure during this time period, and his military prowess certainly was less than effective. Combined with this problem was the president's over-involvement in strategy in the Eastern Theater. In the first year of the war, an impatient president ordered his army commander, Irwin McDowell, to move his forces on the Confederate position at Manassas Junction, Virginia. Lincoln dismissed the general's warnings that his troops were unprepared for the campaign, and consequently, the Union defeat at First Bull Run resulted. In the wake of First Bull Run, Lincoln appointed George McClellan to command the Union Army, the new Army of the Potomac. Over the next few months, McClellan soon whipped the Green regiments into shape, instilling in them discipline and high morale, forging an instrument that would outlast a shocking succession of defeats. In the spring of 1862, McClellan proposed to avoid the heavy fighting that resulted in the march overland between Washington and Richmond, and instead to take the army by water to the peninsula between the York and James rivers. In essence, attack Richmond from the east. While Lincoln agreed to this bold move, he then slowly undermined it by depleting McClellan of authority and men. Before McClellan left, Lincoln had created a new command structure that divided the army into 4 corps, and in 3 of the corps, Lincoln put in people that were opposed to McClellan's plan to begin with. Moreover, in the following weeks, Lincoln divided the Union forces in the East into 7 independent commands and detached 1 entire corps from the army that McClellan had expected would come and help him in the campaign against Richmond. The reason for such a detachment was that the president had been tricked by Stonewall Jackson's maneuvers in the Shenandoah Valley by mistakenly believing that Stonewall Jackson was about to attack Washington. Of course, Jackson that's exactly what he was trying to do, and he was successful in it. His success was compounded by the fact that Lincoln sent some of his unfortunate generals, politicians, to try to find where Jackson was. Instead, Jackson found where the Union forces were, and in a series of attacks, attacked and defeat each of the Union armies that were separated from each other. In the final analysis, none of the Union forces, either under Fremont or Banks, helped Lincoln in Washington, but Stonewall Jackson so defeated the Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley that he was able to then leave the valley and help General Lee defeat McClellan against Richmond. McClellan reached the vicinity of the rebel capital in May. People at the time said they could set their watches by the steeple clocks in Richmond, but waited for reinforcements, the reinforcements that Lincoln promised McClellan but never arrived. As historian Ludwell Johnson states, if given proper support, he probably would have captured the city, such was his strength of heavy artillery. However, by fragmenting the Union forces, Lincoln gave Robert E. Lee an opportunity to strike them one by one. And in the 7 days battle, Lee effectively ended McClellan's threat to Richmond. Lincoln's appointment of John Pope to lead a new Union army in Northern Virginia proved no more successful. At the Second Battle of Bull Run, a confused and outflanked Pope suffered a terrible defeat, and the Union army again retreated back to Washington. Lincoln put McClellan back in the job of leading the army. And as I've mentioned, McClellan was successful in the Union victory at Antietam. But McClellan's opposition to the Emancipation Proclamation and his slow follow-up after the Confederate defeat at Antietam meant McClellan had to go. As Lincoln said, McClellan had a case of the slows, and indeed he did. And so Lincoln minimized the impact on the Democrats because McClellan was a very popular Democrat as well as being a professional general. It was a time, unlike today, when the military leaders really tried to stay out of partisan politics. That was not the way things were during the Civil War. So to minimize the impact on the Democrats, Lincoln both sacked McClellan after the 1862 elections and replaced McClellan with a fellow Democrat by the name of Ambrose Burnside. Now, Burnside was a pretty good judge of his own skills, for twice before this appointment as Army commander, he had been offered the job, and twice before he said, "I'm really not qualified to do it." But he was pressed to do it a third time, and he unfortunately agreed to be Army commander. He soon proved the correctness of his initial estimation of his own skills by smashing the Union Army against an impregnable Confederate position at Fredericksburg in December 1862. And so this caricature in Harper's Weekly, again, this is a northern newspaper, but the disastrous Union defeat at Fredericksburg clearly was open to criticism. And so we have bad news from Fredericksburg, and indeed it was bad news. 12,000 casualties from attacking the Confederate position, a position that never should have been attacked. And so the president is getting bad news. General in Chief Halleck doesn't look altogether happy to get that bad news, and the new Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, is completely shocked by it. Well, it shouldn't have been shocking when you consider who the commander of the Union forces were. But Lincoln kept Burnside for the moment, and so Burnside engaged in the following campaign the following month in January, thinking he could outflank the Confederates at Fredericksburg, but it literally got stuck in the mud. Thus, it became known as the infamous Mud Campaign. And by the campaign getting stuck in the mud, stories are such that whole cannon totally disappeared in the roads. I think that's somewhat legend, but it gives you a sense of how things went. So much so that here we have another Frank Leslie's Illustrated newspaper of now the president is the one that's in the mud. And Lincoln is saying to Jeff Davis in his nest in Richmond, you may laugh, but if it weren't for this mud, I'd soon fetch you out of that. Well, the Mud Campaign coming to a dirty end meant that Burnside was out. He was facing a virtual rebellion of his generals, and Burnside accepted in the inevitable. Lincoln then picked Joseph Hooker, who had a reputation of being a fighting general, but he had no better luck with Joseph Hooker, for Hooker's reputation for fighting must have missed him in the Battle of Chancellorsville, when in fact it was a much outnumbered Confederate army under Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jeb Stuart that did most of the attacking at Chancellorsville. Fortunately, Lincoln judged Hooker's limitation correctly, if belatedly, and he put George Meade in command of the Union Army. And of course, Meade's victory at Gettysburg was the turning point of the war in the East. The following spring, a new general of the armies, Ulysses S. Grant, led the Union campaign in the East. So, I'll say a few words about Grant in a moment, but we have here President Lincoln going to the store to buy a new broom. He needs a broom to sweep away the Confederates. And as you see there on the floor, he's gone through a number of brooms and not too successfully. Pope, McClellan, Hooker. But he finally finds a broom to his liking. And that broom, of course, is Grant. And so the North and the president finally find a general, Grant coming off some sensational Union victories in the West, and Grant is now made overall general-in-chief of all the armies within the Union Army. However, because Grant knew that the president expected only one strategy, and that was to go directly overland between Washington and Richmond, it meant that that would be the most costly of ways to go. And during the overland campaign, the Virginia campaign of 1864, Grant would push his troops towards Richmond, but with great cost to the Union armies. Upwards of 100,000 casualties were lost in the 4-month campaign that put the Federal troops no closer to the capital than they were when McClellan had been there 2 years before. And those level of casualties was significant, not only, of course, for the men who were lost, but for the Army, the military, and politically. Here we have Mrs. North and her attorney. Again, this is a British cartoon, thus not surprisingly it's quite critical. We've got her attorney, Mr. Lincoln, not liking the news that Mrs. North is thinking of getting a new attorney. September of 1864, coming off of the Virginia campaign and those heavy casualties, Lincoln is up for re-election. And Mrs. North may just pick another attorney, someone who's not going to be so costly to the Union Army. While Lincoln's strategy and Grant and Meade's tactics were largely responsible for the heavy losses, an auxiliary campaign against Richmond from the south side failed also. That one was headed by another of Lincoln's political generals, Benjamin Butler, which ended in complete failure with him retreating from a smaller Confederate force, which ultimately bottled him up. Grant talks about Butler by saying this: Butler was in Bermuda Hundred, which is a peninsula south of Richmond, bottled up and strongly corked, and that's where he stayed. The setbacks in Virginia nearly was too much for the Northern public. In August, a despondent Lincoln predicted that he would lose the presidential election 3 months later. He even writes a memorandum getting ready for McClellan to be elected president. Fortunately for Lincoln's mistakes, as serious as they were more than countered by his great presidential successes in the field of the military. Lincoln could be credited for several achievements, but 4 deserve special note. First, Lincoln's commitment to emancipation led to his endorsement of enlisting African Americans into the Union Army. Late in 1862, as he mustered support for the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln passed 2 measures that would allow the president to enlist blacks. He waited for the early part of 1863 to announce his support for black Union regiments. This would deal the rebellion a double blow. Since most of the new black soldiers were former slaves, their absence from the fields denied their economic value to the South. Their example led other slaves to abandon the fields and seek freedom, thus compounding the rebels' labor problems. At the same time, their presence in the Union Army swelled the ranks of the Army to crush the Confederates militarily. Eventually, a total of 180,000 blacks would be enlisted in the Union Army, making up 12% of the total force. Second, Lincoln's naval successes, through the excellent efforts of Secretary Gideon Welles, Admiral David Farragut, and others, brought some of the greatest strides to victory. Welles started with a navy of just 50 vessels and turned it into the world's largest force of some 800 ships during the war. The overwhelming strength of the Union Navy was critical to the Federal victory. The Navy blockaded the southern ports with increasing effectiveness as the war progressed, denying the Confederates vital supplies such as salt, leather, and medicines. As crucial, the Navy's gradual control of the river system throughout the South, the Mississippi, the Cumberland, the Tennessee, the Arkansas, cut away the Southern Confederacy until defeat became inevitable for the dismembered South. Here we have a case, another British cartoon, pointing out actually a great Union victory, but the British just can't give Lincoln any credit for anything. So they've got to make fun of him in any case. So here we have Abraham Lincoln sitting in the corner. As you know the children's rhyme, little Jack Corner sat in the corner eating a Christmas pie, put in his thumb, pulled out a thumb, and said, "What a good boy am I." Well, that's the rhyme. We've got Lincoln here in the corner pulling out the plum. What is the plum? The plum is the most important port of the Confederacy, New Orleans. And in April of 1862, David Farragut and the Union Navy surprised the Confederates by coming up from the Gulf and capturing New Orleans, and thus closing off a major port to the Confederacy and opening up a major port for the Union, for the federal government, which interestingly had important economic consequences, because one of the things that the Confederates thought that they could win the war with was what was called King Cotton diplomacy, of holding back the cotton so the British and the French would enter into our war to get the cotton. Well, a lot of the cotton now was in the hands of the Union through the port of New Orleans. So King Cotton diplomacy turned out to be illusionary. Third, in addition to African Americans becoming Union soldiers and the effective naval policy, Lincoln's State Department, headed by Secretary Seward and brilliantly supported by a cast that included our ambassador to Great Britain, Charles Francis Adams, the son of President John Quincy Adams, kept the war from becoming an international struggle. And this was critical because while we were able to handle the Confederacy, we probably would not have been able to effectively fight off the British and the French and the Confederates and still be successful. Seward's firm messages that European intervention on behalf of the Confederacy would mean war with the United States was tempered by his dedication to peaceful relations and Ambassador Adams constantly toning down Seward's somewhat bellicose statements. As a result, Europeans remained wary enough to stay neutral until the military contest showed that the Confederacy could not win. As a result, the Confederacy failed to receive diplomatic recognition by any one international power. Finally, Lincoln's military success in the Western theater assured the end of the Confederacy well before Lee met Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Lincoln's appointment of professionals to head his Western armies and the quality of these selections assured consecutive victories as often as his poorer Eastern selections brought defeats. He was also less involved in the Western strategies and tactics, leaving them to military commanders such as Grant. Lincoln's selection of Grant in the West brought Union victories at Forts Henry's and Donelston in February of 1862, which opened up the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers to Union advance. Grant's Vicksburg campaign of 1863 split the Confederacy into two and was accomplished with the loss of less than 10,000 casualties, while the Confederates lost nearly 50,000 men. On the rare occasion when the Western general failed to perform, such as the case of William Rosecrans, Lincoln replaced him with Grant and George Thomas, and what followed were the victories of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge. But one campaign that brought ultimate victory was William Tecumseh Sherman's skillful effort against the Confederate stronghold of Atlanta. When in September, Lincoln received Sherman's terse telegram, "Atlanta is ours and fairly won," he knew that his re-election was more certain, and with it, the fate of the Union and emancipation. And so as this cartoon shows from Harper's Weekly, the long Abraham a little longer, coming off his spectacular reelection in 1864. Lincoln also sustained Sherman's concept of total war and endorsed the March to the Sea, which destroyed the South psychologically as much as the fall of Atlanta had done militarily. The curtain came down on the rebellion in the West, making the end of Lee's efforts in Virginia somewhat anticlimactic. On the balance sheet, then, Abraham Lincoln had many more successes than failures. While his political methods raised constitutional questions, at least there was a constitution in 1865. As historian Philip Palatine states, the constitutional instrument for changing governments was still in 1865 what it had been in 1861: win a free election and gain the majority of the electoral votes. In human terms, because of Lincoln, 4 million black Americans gained options beyond a life of slavery for themselves and their children. Men, women, and children were no longer bought and sold, denied their humanity. It was Lincoln that was also to inspire as many as 2 million soldiers and countless civilians to continue the fight until the end. And there were two lasting international consequences from Lincoln's achievement. First, foreign oppressors of the 20th century were not allowed to run free, disregarding the 2 or 3 or perhaps even 4 countries that may have existed if the Union had not been preserved. And finally, Lincoln proved that the world's greatest republic could survive its bloodiest war and continue to serve as a beacon of liberty and democracy for the rest of humankind. That is no small accomplishment. So this cartoon, obviously not during the Civil War. This is a British cartoon. Needless to say, the British of 1941 were a little bit more disposed to Lincoln than back in 1863. We've got here Lincoln's warning to Roosevelt. We've got the ghost of Abraham Lincoln coming to Franklin Roosevelt just 10 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, basically saying to Franklin Roosevelt, I was able to free the slaves in the United States, but you have a greater task. You have to free the rest of the world. And that is, of course, the consequence of the Union victory in the Civil War. Thank you. Are there questions? Any questions? Oh.
What were the, were there 8 states, kind of northern section of the southern states that that were in effect up for grabs? And what states were they? That's my question.
Okay, so with the border, we had the 4 border states that stayed in the Union. So those were Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware. Thank you. And so those were the ones that stayed. And then the upper southern states that left were North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas. Yep, those would be the other 4.
Thank you.
Yep. Other questions? Sure.
Benjamin Butler. I want to say one good word about Benjamin Butler.
Go right ahead.
In May of 1861, a couple of slaves rode across Hampton Roads, came into Butler's territory there at Fort Monroe, and he actually brought them into his office and talked to them and let them stay. So that was kind of the beginning of what turned out to be a huge undertaking to allow the slaves to come into Union lines and serve in
Absolutely.
the Union
Benjamin Butler From a political point of view, Benjamin Butler was very important because the whole concept of contraband, which is what Butler created in Virginia at Fort Monroe, was very critical in that first step. Lincoln was cautious not to aggravate those border states to, move towards emancipation. So it was generals like Butler and Fremont, for his part in Missouri, that kind of pushed the envelope. Lincoln sometimes pushed back because he was concerned about the political fallout. But Butler and some of those political generals, from a political point of view, clearly were very positive. Butler also, among his less than favorable nicknames, was called Spoons Butler for some of his involvement when he was in charge of New Orleans. But he was in strong defense of his soldiers. So when New Orleans was occupied, of course, by the Union soldiers, some of the Southern women, in protest against the Union soldiers, would take their chamber pots and dump them out the windows on the Union soldiers. To which Butler then made a new rule that any woman that disrespected any Southern woman who disrespected a Union soldier would be considered a woman of the evening and would be accordingly treated that way. And that did cut down on the chamber pots going out the windows.
You brought up an interesting point about how there was no foreign intervention.
Yes.
Can you expound on that a little bit? Because it's surprising that it was so little foreign intervention.
So the British and the French were both pro-Confederate, particularly the French were. And that was a reason for that, because at that time the Emperor of the French, Napoleon III, was in the process of conquering Mexico and is trying to establish a French empire in Central America. So of course it was to his interest that the Confederacy were to survive. The British were more divided, though, and Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, before his death in 1861, were very much pro-Union and anti-slavery. And so the British were more even on it, and even though there were many British interests worried about the cotton, because the South was the primary cotton producer in the world at that time, and urged more involvement, there were enough sensible people in Britain that didn't push it. Now, there was some involvement. Some of the British did manufacture vessels that ultimately found their way into the Confederate Navy. So there was some support, but from a governmental point of view, they stayed out of it. And then ultimately, the British did compensate us after the war for the vessels actually destroying much of our maritime fleet. Any other questions? Well, once again, thank you very much for coming. We have our monthly programs the third Sunday of each month. So we will have one in March back here at 2 o'clock. So you are welcome for that. And there are some refreshments afterwards. So thank you.